engagement at the Applied Research Institute. And we sponsor this seminar series, Grounds on the Go, with the UVA Research Park. That's Katie Murphy, who helps me organize these. And the idea is to bring the researchers, scholars, thinkers from UVA up to the research park or to other locations around Charlottesville and into our community to talk about their work and how it relates to things that are in the news and are important in the moment. And so obviously this one is going to be a really interesting discussion. So I want to introduce David. David Leblang is Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia and is also a faculty associate at the Miller Center, where he is the J. Wilson Newman Professor of Governance. He's also a professor of public policy at the university's Batten School for Leadership and Public Policy, where he directs the Global Policy Center. Since 2010, he has served as the department chair in the Department of Politics. A scholar in the area of international political economy, he has expertise in international immigration, financial crises, and international political economy. Recent articles have appeared in the International Innovation, the American Political Science Review, World Politics, and the American Journal of Political Science. In 2006, he co-authored Democratic Processes in Financial Markets with William Bernard. In 2015, Leblang was awarded the Excellence in Faculty Mentoring Award by the University of Virginia's Office of the Provost, and in 2016, he will receive the Mentoring Award given by the Society of Women in International Political Economy. So it's my pleasure to introduce David Leblang to talk to us about his research on European migration and the crisis we're seeing, and also Isabel Merritt, a fourth-year student in politics who worked with David on this project, is also going to speak, right? Okay, so that'll be great. So we'll get to hear some student perspective on research. So thank you.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that Melissa gave me a very nice introduction, but she didn't mention the most important thing I do at the university, which is I teach, right? And it's a wonderful opportunity to be here to share some of the work that I've been doing with Isabel Merritt, who's a fourth year, unfortunately not a politics major, but that's forgivable, as are most things. So what I want to do and what we want to do is we want to talk for a little bit about the European migration crisis. Put it into some larger perspective, think about migration from a global perspective, but then also make sure that we end early enough so that there's time for question and answer. I know a number of people in the audience who I know at the university or around the university are working or are concerned about this issue. So again, it's important that we have enough time to have a conversation rather than you all just sit there and listen to the astounding things that Isabel is going to tell you, okay? So I wanted to situate things from the perspective from which I understand and examine them. So I'm a political scientist, and the way that I think about immigration, just like the way I think about, or I thought about financial markets when I was studying them, is to try and understand the way in which these phenomena influence the behavior of policymakers. Right? So if I look at the European migration crisis, the question I ask is not how terrible is this and what can be done about it, although those are important questions and important issues. The question that I ask as a scholar is, how do policymakers think about this? How does it influence the behavior of policymakers, and how can we use that lens to understand what's occurring within Europe? So I've been working on questions related to migration for probably, almost 10 years now. And my perspective is that of a political economist. So I look at patterns. I try and understand four basic sets of questions. I want to know where migrants come from. That is to say, what are the causes, what are the forces that give rise to the desire on the part of individuals to leave their country of birth, leave their country of origin, and seek a different place to live, right? So that's question number one. Question number two is, where do migrants go? Right? So assume that you decide that you want to leave your country either because there's a civil war, because there's been a natural disaster, or because the economy is bad. There are a menu of choices. There are lots of different options for you when you think about where you go. So the second question I address in my research is, thinking about where do migrants choose to go. Third question is, what are the consequences of immigration for the host country or the destination country? That is to say, how do migrants, newly arrived migrants, how do they influence politics, political attitudes, the rise of radical right-wing parties, and basically the survival of policymakers in those countries where they go? And then the fourth question is, how do policymakers respond, right? So given a crisis, or given that policymakers have an incentive to decrease the flow of immigrants into their country, what do they do in order to decrease the demand for entry into their country, right? So those are the four questions that I'm interested in my research. We don't have time. And I usually say to my students, we don't have an entire semester to devote to all of those questions. We can really only address one. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to zero in on the refugee crisis within Europe. And we're going to think about and try and understand the different ways that policymakers try and deal with the demand for asylum or the demand for refuge within those countries. Okay. Let me say one more thing just to give you a sense of how I came to work with Isabel on this project. About a year ago, I was working on a project that focused on the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And I asked myself the question, this is some work with William Bernard, who's at the University of Illinois. We asked ourselves the question, why in the world did Germany have an incentive to bail out Greece? Not just once, not just twice, but three times, right? Why is it in the interests of German policymakers to bail out a government in Greece that was widely viewed as highly profligate? And the argument that we made is that the Germans were concerned about an influx of unskilled labor coming from Southern Europe into Germany. Right? And in the process of doing that research, in the process of trying to understand the incentive of German policymakers, that's when I met Isabel, because I can't read German. Right? And so I sent emails around looking for students who were interested in the project, and Isabel came and started working with me on that project, focusing on the German bailout of Greece. And as we were doing that research over the summer, then the refugee crisis unfolded. And so we were in a sense, we were in the right place at the right time to pick up and start focusing on this question having to do with refugees. Okay? So again, I want to talk about the refugee crisis, but I also want to give you a sense of how we think about refugees and kind of the bigger picture. So when I started thinking about migration and the way I approach it, I tend to have in mind pictures that look like this. Right? So these are, pictures of Ellis Island. They are of migrants coming from primarily Western Europe in the 1910s and 1920s, coming to look for a better life. Right? This is the imagery that we think of when we look at Ellis Island. This is from Godfather 2. This is a young Vito Corleone looking out at the Statue of Liberty. He has come to seek a better life. He has come to seek a place where he can have more freedom. Right? Now, if we fast forward, I wish I didn't have this at the bottom, right? This tells you where it's from, but if you look at that picture at the top, you could say, I don't know where that's coming from, right? That could be the crisis in the Mediterranean as it is right now, but this is actually the Mariel boat lift, okay? 1978, 1979 in Miami, and then this is Tent City, the area under the interstates where refugees fleeing Cuba when Fidel Castro opened the doors, where they were living for some time, right? Fast forward, right, to this past summer. This is a picture of refugees fleeing North Africa. This is in the Aegean Sea, right? Hopefully setting off to Greece. From Greece, the hope then on the part of the refugees that they enter into the European Union. All right. Now I'm going to show you two other pictures. And I'm not going to tell you where they're from, but we can compare and contrast. So here's another picture, right, of refugees that are facing a border fence. And here's another picture of refugees facing the border fence. Any ideas where those pictures are from? Pardon me? So yeah, that's right. This is Mexico. This is Croatia. That was outstanding. Okay. So what's important when I think about this topic, when we think about refugees, is to understand that the European migration crisis is not something that is solely a problem or solely a concern within the European space, right? We need to talk about the ways in which migration is an issue, not just within Europe, but within the world as a whole, right? And then, again, we ask the question with regard to with regard to Europe, is where do they come from, right? So this is, again, just to give you a little a sense of the origin of migrants and the origins of this crisis that we've been observing, right? Most of the immigrants that were leaving Syria were headed to Germany. They enter Syria, they leave Syria, they enter Turkey, or they go through the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean to try and get to Italy or Spain, ultimately with the goal of getting to Germany, right? But it's important to note, and Isabel will talk a little bit about this in a minute, is that there are a number of transit countries on the way to Germany, right? So no Syrians end up in Germany just by crossing a border, right? And borders are very important as we think about what countries can do in order to protect them and what countries do in order to establish a buffer zone to protect their countries. Okay, now I want to make another important distinction here, and that's between labor migrants or migrants and refugees. So this is the 1951 UN Convention on the Status of Refugees. You see the parts here in bold that are very important. Okay, and this is a convention that governs national behavior insofar as refugees are concerned to date. Okay? And again, this is important because countries that signed on to the UN Convention have an obligation under international law to not return those refugees to their home countries, right? And so what it specifies here is that it specifies that somebody is a refugee. Okay, actually, let me dial this back a second. The UN Convention, it's important to note, was written and was passed at the height of the Cold War. Okay? The framing of the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union has important implications for how this piece of international law is interpreted. Okay? Part number one is this idea that there needs to be a well-founded fear of being persecuted, right? That was broadly defined in the eyes of the beholder. Okay? When this was written, the prototypical refugee or individual who could qualify for refugee status was someone who was fleeing the Soviet Union. Okay. Part number two here is that it only includes individuals who are outside the country of his nationality. Okay. What that means is that there's no provision in this piece of international law for what are called internally displaced people. So the millions of people in Syria or in the Congo or in Colombia who have been displaced from their homes as a result of civil war do not qualify as refugees under international law. They do not qualify for refugee status. Third thing here, and again, this is very important too, is that this well-founded fear of persecution is political. Right? What that means is that you do not get refugee status if you are fleeing a natural disaster, if the economy has collapsed and you decide to pick up and move somewhere else, right? If there is an outbreak of disease, right? That does not give you under international law the status of refugee, all right? And that's critically important to understand as we think about even the rhetoric that has been used and continues to be used within Europe. If you listen to policymakers, Angela Merkel or any other policymaker in Austria, in Hungary, in Germany, in Croatia, they will refer to the Syrians, the Afghanis, the Pakistanis who are entering their country as migrants. Because as soon as they call them refugees, they have an obligation under international law to provide minimal levels of protection, okay? And they have an obligation under international law to not return them to their countries of origin, all right? And given that they will have that obligation, our research asks the question, how do they keep those refugees from coming in the first place, okay? Another piece of housekeeping business is to just kind of lay the groundwork. You know, everybody talks about this refugee crisis or this migration crisis as being the largest in our lifetimes. That is probably, that is undoubtedly true. There are a number of other crises that have occurred since World War II, Hungary, Vietnam, Darfur, Afghanistan, etc. Syria is a huge problem in terms of refugees, but is probably the largest crisis in terms of internally displaced people that we've seen on this planet in the last 2 centuries. Okay. And again, here's just a sense of where they are. Right, so where are refugees? Again, it is primarily, you know, the largest number of refugees are in Turkey and in Lebanon, but they're also in Pakistan, Iran, and Ethiopia. Large numbers in the Congo, large numbers in Colombia. Again, this is not just a European problem. Next piece of information, at least to kind of situate things, is to think about asylum seekers. Okay? Because there are differences between refugees and asylum seekers. The important part here is that an asylum seeker is somebody who has applied for recognition in another country. Okay? They are considered an asylum seeker until they are granted asylum. What that means is that the tens of, or the hundreds of thousands of individuals who are seeking refugee status are really in some sort of limbo, either in a destination country or in a refugee camp. Okay, on a border of Syria or in Turkey or in Lebanon. Okay, and again, we can give you a sense of where people are applying for asylum. You know, it's no surprise to anybody, but that the largest number of asylum seekers are seeking asylum in Germany, a large number in Turkey and the United States of America. South of the Sahara, the largest destination for asylum seekers is in sub-Saharan Africa. So now let's turn to the current crisis and what we've been studying. So we asked the question, you know, where do these migrants come from, right? And what's the nature of this crisis? It's an easy answer to say that it's the civil war in Syria, okay? And I would be hard-pressed to tell you that that is not a proximate or a necessary condition for the influx of refugees and migrants that we're seeing in Western Europe, okay? But the causes of the current crisis are multifaceted. Okay, let's go back about 20 years and think about what was happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, and Africa south of the Sahara, you had migration going north, leading into Tunisia, leading into Morocco, leading into Egypt. Okay, so you have a ready mass of individuals who have already picked up and have been dislocated from their home country that are sitting in North Africa. Okay, you have what's generating those migrants, those displaced people, are civil war in sub-Saharan Africa. You have food shortages and environmental crises, you know, and we can go on and on about climate and those sorts of problems. Excuse me. In 2000, late 2000s, again, if you harken back to 2006, 2007, 2008, there was a global food crisis where the price of commodities, the prices of grains went sky high. And so you had people leave, people in agricultural countries were leaving the countryside, leaving farmlands, leaving arable lands, and are moving to the cities. Okay? So in sub-Saharan Africa especially, or actually in Africa as a whole, you see an intense amount of urbanization. Right? This becomes really important if we think about Syria. Right? One of the reasons why the conflict in Syria generated so many internally displaced people and so many refugees is because a majority of the population had left the countryside and had started living in large cities like Aleppo. Okay? And once the civil war begins and it intensifies, focused on those cities, the individuals have nowhere else to go, right? They can't go to the cities, they're in the cities, and they can't go back to the countryside because there's no area for sustainable living on the countryside. The arable land has essentially been destroyed, okay? So again, this is 2010. 2011, 2012, we see the Arab Spring, right? So you have revolutions in Egypt, in Tunisia, to some degree in Morocco. That causes these waves of migrants that we've already talked about moving from sub-Saharan Africa into North Africa. These migrants then move into Southern Europe, okay? They enter through Libya, or they go through Libya, they enter through Malta, Spain, Greece, and Italy, okay? So you have a large number, hundreds of thousands of largely unskilled Africans that have now moved into the European Union, all right? The financial crisis hits, okay? Greece, Portugal, Spain, Cyprus, I know I'm forgetting one. Anyway, one to be named later. They have financial crisis, right? The economy collapses, unemployment rates skyrocket. You have migrants within the European Union leaving the south, heading to the north, okay? All of this is happening from 2010 through 2014, 2015, when the shock of Libya hits Europe. All right, so it's not just civil war in Syria that is generating this migration pressure in the European Union and in the Mediterranean. It's all of the crises that led up to it and that generated a large demand for immigration into the European Union at that time. Right? So countries then begin thinking about what's the best way that they can deter these migrants from entering. And that's some of the work that Isabel has been doing.
Okay, so I'm just a mere undergraduate, so I'm going to reference my cheat sheet a little bit. So as Professor Leblang has been talking about, we have 3 or 4 main research topics. So what generates migrants? Where do they go? What are the consequences for the host? And how can they deter migration? So the question of migration deterrence has been my main research topic over the last several months as we've been researching. And the main deterrence methods that we've researched include changes to border and asylum policies, increases in various forms of foreign aid, and military interventions. So the questions we're seeking to answer in our research are what policies are effective in not only deterring migrants, but also what are effective in helping the humanitarian crisis at hand. So to a large degree, we're basing our argument that the states want to deter migrants on the assumption that politicians want to stay in power. So they obviously stay in power by abiding by the will and demand of the people. So even though many Europeans and policymakers and politicians, they understand the crisis at hand and they might want to provide refuge to asylum seekers, they must also understand the constituent fears of problems with integration, cultural shifts, and job security that come with hundreds of thousands of migrants. Angela Merkel, for example, was named Times Person of the Year this year for setting a humanitarian example for Germany and for the rest of the EU. But public opinion in Germany has shifted greatly over the last several months. So for example, a poll conducted by ZDF, which is a German media firm, they asked the question in both July of 2015 and January of this year, can Germany handle this many refugees? And so you can see the complete shift that's occurred over mere months. So now the majority of Germans would say no, they cannot handle this many refugees. And so the effect was that Angela Merkel has had to make several backtracks in recent months. So Germany now has plans to deport refugees and migrants who acquire significant criminal records. And they've also had plans to eradicate refugee benefits if they don't actively seek jobs or participate in cultural integration programs. So energizing a lot of this anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment has been a rise in radical right-wing parties. So these parties are not new to the refugee crisis, as Professor Leblang was also talking about. There was a huge financial crisis last year, and these parties were gaining a lot of notoriety for their anti-Euro sentiments. So again, yeah. And so as an example of their popularity, a media analysis done by Vocative between late April and between late August of this past summer found that many of these parties significantly grew in the number of likes that they had on Facebook. So for example, the Denmark People's Party grew by over 67%, France's National Front grew by 13%, and several other smaller parties grew by notable percentages. With regard to actual government influence, the Austria's Freedom Party secured nearly 1/3 of the vote in the mayor's election in Vienna. And so even though they didn't end up winning the election, securing 1/3 of the vote in what is traditionally one of Europe's most liberal capitals is incredibly significant. The Denmark People's Party also finished second in their June parliamentary election to win 21% of seats. So this is all really significant, and these political shifts are really significant to our research for 3 big reasons. So first, it's correlated to our earlier question of what drives policy change. So a rise in radical support and anti-immigrant sentiments among constituents makes it really challenging for policymakers to support open borders or humanitarian efforts with regard to refugees if they actually want to sustain their popularity. So secondly, rising radical right support also has impacts on where refugees decide to go. If a refugee is looking to go to, say, the Netherlands, but they're scared about the backlash that they might face due to these percentages, they might decide to go elsewhere. And so that relates to our research question of where do they go, and we want to know where they go and why. And then lastly, looking at the refugee crisis with this lens will just help us contribute to the broader political science literature of what drives radical right support. So what I've been talking about so far answers the question of why they're interested in deterring migrants. So now we'll briefly talk about how they actually deter migrants. So first we'll look at recent changes to border and asylum policies on the EU level. So the Dublin Regulation was adopted in 1997 and has been the EU's primary method of asylum processing since then, up until 2015. So it has been suspended in many EU states due to the unexpected stresses brought on by the migration crisis and the unique nature of the migration crisis. So historically, the regulation stated, quote, that the country in which a person's claim for asylum is first lodged should be responsible for that entire asylum claim. So this typically is done in the first country in the EU in which a refugee lands. So this has become especially difficult, obviously, in this crisis because of the irregular nature of travel done by most migrants and refugees. So if they're traveling by sea, the first countries they're going to come across are the Mediterranean countries. And so this would be Greece, Italy, Malta, Bulgaria, etc. And all of these countries have been facing significant economic hardships in recent months. And that means they're not as capable of handling, as processing as many asylum claims. And so that's why they ended up, several countries have suspended the Dublin Regulation, thereby allowing them to process the refugees asylum first. So the other relevant policy in this crisis is the Schengen Agreement, which has been the EU's method of open borders among member states for decades. In many ways, it embodies a lot of what the EU is all about, open borders, open travel. But the Schengen Agreement is also perhaps a cause for why the Dublin Regulation was suspended. Many asylum seekers took advantage of the EU's open borders to try to reach the more prosperous and welcoming states in the north, like Germany, Sweden, etc., before filing their asylum applications. And when you think about it, that kind of makes sense. I think I would rather be in Germany, perhaps, than Greece during a major financial crisis. In many ways, this northward travel kind of became the face of the migration crisis as we know it. I'm sure most people in this room have seen a lot of newspaper articles or documentaries about how they travel northward. I've seen lots of videos and pictures of people hiking through mountains, or winter conditions with nothing but backpacks and their children. There's a really interesting German documentary on migrants in Greece who actually rode underneath the trucks to escape Greece. So this unregulated inflow of people was not taken very lightly by a lot of Schengen member states, however, and there have been a lot of changes initiated that undermined the original intent of the agreement. So this map shows the number of states that have increased border controls. So for example, Sweden has adopted some policies that when a train is coming into Sweden, they'll check for migrants and make sure that everybody has their proper papers, otherwise it will escort people out of the country. So this map shows the number of countries that have built fences in order to try to deter migrants along their southern border. And this map I think is really awesome because it's exactly showing where they're going and where they're building fences. They're not just building random fences. It clearly correlates to migration flow. And this is an example of, fences aren't always the most efficient way to do this. This is a family crossing the Hungarian-Croatian border. So in addition to changes to border and asylum policy, other methods of deterrence that we've researched include foreign aid and military responses, so as to help stabilize internal situations in the sending countries. So with regard to, say, Syria, there was little to no outside military aid until 2015. The Charlie Hebdo attacks and the further attacks in November tremendously affected the political support for military intervention. And so, the UK voted, I think, a matter of days to assist the US coalition against Syria, while Germany, it was a few weeks after the November attacks in Paris. So another enormous development occurred just last Thursday, in fact, which kind of shows the rapid changing of this crisis, when NATO announced that their ships would occupy the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey, so as to help deter human trafficking and smuggling. In effect, they're attempting to prevent possible migration across the Aegean Sea into Europe, which hopefully will prevent thousands of unnecessary deaths, but it's also preventing people from reaching their destinations. But so this NATO involvement is really, really huge to our research because NATO has steered clear of any military intervention in Syria thus far. And so this kind of brings us back to our research questions. We're interested in researching why there has been such a different response in the Syrian crisis than to say the other crises of our research, which include Libya, other Arab Spring countries, and the Balkan crises of the 1990s. So NATO, for example, almost got immediately involved in Libya when Gaddafi began violently resisting the Arab Spring. The EU and the UN were heavily involved in the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. Why was Syria so different? So So overwhelmingly also the type of foreign aid that's been sent to Syria has been very different in recent years. They mostly receive humanitarian aid, so things that support food, shelter, emergency medical care, etc. While in Libya, or say like Egypt and Tunisia, the main types of foreign aid they were receiving in the years leading up to the Arab Spring and after have been economic in nature or military aid. We found all this through aiddata.org. So this it really just contrasts. So we're interested in seeing and painting the picture of what strategic choices have been made by the host countries and why they make them and how effective they are.
All right, so I'm just going to conclude really quickly to mention that we're talking about a variety of different kinds of policy choices, right? And what Isabel is mentioning towards the end is it allows us to broaden our frame of inquiry, which is to not just ask the question, where do migrants come from and where do migrants go? But once you use migration as a lens through which you can understand a nation's political and economic policy choices, things become a lot different, right? So if we ask the question, or which is the question that we do ask, right? When we ask the question, how do you understand intervention in the Balkans, in Libya, no intervention in the Arab Spring, and then no intervention on the military side in Syria, our response or our answer is it all has to do with the likelihood that countries that would get involved or that would intervene are going to be influenced by, excuse me, an unwanted inflow of refugees, okay? And when we use that lens, it helps us understand other kinds of foreign policy choices, notably overseas development assistance, right? So we can think about the ways in which overseas development aid is targeted not necessarily at developmental objectives or not necessarily at objectives that are associated with helping countries overcome natural disasters. What we found in our research is that while overseas development aid is targeted to humanitarian interests, it's generally targeted at those countries that would, all else equal, generate a flow of migrants or refugees to the donor country. Okay? That's why we didn't see an enormous amount of aid going to Rwanda or Sudan, and why we did see a lot of aid going to Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, etc. Right? It's not because, I mean, certainly the nature of the crises were different, right? But the proximity to Europe was very different, and the likelihood that those countries were going to generate an outflow of aid was very different. The other thing that it helps us understand is to think about foreign policy choices that governments are making today. Right? So I was stunned, as were other folks who look at the European Union, when I think it was about 3 months ago, probably the end of December or middle of December, when Germany invited Turkey to the table to begin discussions of Turkey's ascension into the European Union. Right? People who study the European Union would say this is never going to happen, right? Because with Schengen, Turkey would then be able to, or unskilled Turkish workers would be able to enter the European Union without any barriers, okay? And that would generate tremendous political, social, ethnic conflict, and especially labor market conflict, okay? But then you say, you know what Germany's trying to do is they're trying to buy Turkish cooperation in managing the refugee crisis. The European Union has now allocated $2 billion in aid to Turkey, the hopes being that Turkey will keep those refugees that are on the camps on the border with Syria, keep those refugees in place. Okay? Now this is nothing that should surprise us. Think about US policy with regard to Mexico. Okay? During last year's foreign aid appropriation, the United States allocated $150 million worth of foreign economic assistance to Mexico, with the caveat that Mexico used that money to protect its southern border. Okay? The idea being that if Mexico protected its southern border, then the migrants that are fleeing the violence in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua can't enter Mexico. And if they can't get into Mexico, then they can't get into the United States. Right? So it makes us think about policies that are focused on buffer states. Right? And then I would just by way of conclusion, you know, I think it's important because, because we think it's interesting. Maybe it's not interesting for the group, but we think it's very interesting, right? That, you know, 2 years ago, or 2 summers ago in the United States, the summer of 2014, there was a crisis of unaccompanied minors that are entering the US southern border, okay? And if you look at the data come 2014, you can see, you know, the number of unaccompanied children that were apprehended in 2014, right? A large spike in those numbers. Policymakers trying to figure out how to deal with this problem. What we then focus on through the lens of our research is to think about what generates that number of migrants. Why a demand for that many migrants, especially unaccompanied minors, entering through the Mexican Texas border for the most part. And we would argue, although this is simply speculative at this point in time, is a lot of it has to do with the level of violence that occurs within Central American countries. Okay? The implication for our research then would be to focus on and to think about the ways in which US policy could be directed at stemming the number of homicides and the rate of homicides that are occurring within those countries. The idea being that if you can stem or you can decrease those homicides, you decrease the incentive for individuals to leave El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and enter the United States. Similarly, we make the same argument when we look at aid and other kinds of assistance that are targeted at Syria, when we think about the aid that was given to Libya, when we think about the role that NATO plays, when we put on our migration glasses, right? Everything kind of falls into place. Countries use their policies in order to protect their borders. Sometimes they protect their borders by building fences. Other times they use policies that go beyond the border. And for the sake of time, we'll wrap it up there. Happy to entertain any questions, talk more about some of the work that we're doing. And again, I know there's a lot of people in this room who are interested in these kinds of questions, so maybe we can draw them into this conversation as well. Yeah, Jeff. Oh, and you know, when you ask a question, you want to introduce yourself.
So Jeff with the Politics Department of Provost's office. So one of the things I was thinking about is in the deterrence realm is whether you're seeing more right-wing violence, right? So we would expect there would be a right-wing reaction and that those parties would become more popular. Are governments giving them more rein to create a less favorable climate? How would you get at that? That would be something I might expect as an implicit policy, or police authorities themselves are doing it without national government approval, kind of thing.
Yeah, so it's a terrific question, and it's something that really generates a whole set of other questions as we think about the way in which right-wing political parties influence not only flows of migrants to particular countries, but then also deflect those flows to other countries. The one case that I know of, and Isabel, you might want to jump in on this, in the case of Germany, you know, one of the reasons why Angela Merkel initially said, we are going to take all refugees, you know, Germany will not turn you away, is because she was responding immediately to the kinds of anti-immigrant, really very pro-Nazi demonstrations that were going on in the southern part of that country, right? And so I know that the German government has really been looking very closely and reining in the kinds of, or providing constraints on the kinds of demonstrations that can occur. The opposite is the case in Hungary and Austria, okay, where the political parties that are in power are really, they are emboldened by the kinds of populist rhetoric that are occurring within these countries. And I think, you know, they are building fences. It is not just because they want to, but because it really speaks to the kinds of political support they're getting. Whether they're allowing, you know, these radical right-wing parties more latitude, I don't have any documentary evidence, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's, you know, that's kind of hand in glove. Isabel, do you want to talk more about the German case?
I would say there was a lot of outrage after the New Year's Eve attacks in Cologne, and recently, you know, they've uncovered who actually committed the crimes on that day, and there were only 3 actual refugees out of, I think, 58 total people. And so I would say it's not, the state can't control everything with regard to public fears. And I know also there's a really interesting statistic done by the Amadeo Antonio Stiftung. So they collect hate crime data, and so in Germany, of just 10 months in 2015, there were over 450 attacks on asylum shelters, compared to in 2014, there were less than 130. So that's all I would say.
You have found any evidence that these policies have been effective, these preventative measures?
You know, it's really too soon to tell. And let me be clear about and so if we talk about fences, it's too soon to tell, right? And one of the reasons why it's too soon to tell is because we don't know, number one, we don't see any data covering the last couple of months, right? Number two, there is a presumption too strong of a word. It is reasonable to assume that a large number of individuals who can't get into if they're heading towards Sweden or if they're heading to Germany through Austria, if they can't get in through legal means, then they may get in through irregular or through illegal means, right? And we won't know that really until some of the data collection effort has been done, okay? Now we can pull back and think about some of these other policies. So some of these foreign aid policies have been effective, right? When you think about if there's a disaster, if there's civil conflict, funneling foreign aid into those environments to basically decrease the conditions that would lead individuals to want to leave, that has been effective. Okay? And part of it varies. I mean, all of these conclusions are conditional. Part of it's conditional upon how the aid is distributed. Part of it is conditional upon the severity of the crisis that generated the demand to leave the country. And part of it really has to do with geography. Are there countries that surround the country in question where individuals can go and be protected as displaced people within refugee camps, for example, right? So Syria is located in a very, this is a terrible thing to say, but it's in a very friendly neighborhood in the sense that that Lebanon, Turkey, etc., and Jordan have been willing to take in large numbers of refugees. Now that willingness is running up against a wall, right? And then we'll have to see. Then we'll have to see what happens, right? But that's a very different situation than we saw in the Sudan in the 1990s. Yes, sir.
Have you done any research about the question?
Can you speak up, please?
Oh, sorry. Have you done any research about the question why Germany is really taking in that many? Is it really just the humanitarian aspect, or is there also an economic reason for that?
Do you want to speak to Germany? So the question is there, what's the reason why Germany is doing this?
So, relating to a lot of the research I did this summer on the more financial aspects of the crisis, Germany, in many ways, perhaps can handle this many refugees. Most of the refugees aren't uneducated. Syria, in many ways, was pretty modern. And Germany's demographics is shifting. They have their younger population is shrinking. They need immigrants to sustain their economic growth. So I guess that could be an underlying thing, but I think that sentiment among politicians is changing.
But has this ever become publicly?
I haven't seen that any politicians ever saying that, but that's just my limited reading.
I mean, there is, some of the policymakers have, again, when the Syrian crisis first unfolded, the statements from German policymakers were that we can take the Syrians. They are, the people who are fleeing. If you think about the pictures of the Syrians who were stuck in, it was the railway station in Vienna, I think, or was it in Budapest? I can't remember, right? But they were on a train. They had bought their tickets. They had their belongings. This was a picture of middle income, educated migrants who were fleeing Syria, which is a very different picture of the migrants that were coming from Southern Europe during the financial crisis, right? Which were lower educated, lower income individuals who were seeking, again, the stereotype is they were seeking to live on the public dole, right? Now, those things changed very quickly, right? Once, again, it became publicized that it was really only about 60 to 65% of the refugees were from Syria. The remainder were from Iran, they're from Pakistan, or from Afghanistan, they're from Eritrea, they're from the Congo, okay? And that's when Germany began to walk back its public pronouncement about, we can take all comers. Right? And part of it has to do with the screening process. It has to do with the screening process, right? So, who you let in and who do you not let in. The one other part that I'll mention is that, and it's important when we think about the definition of a refugee. So Germany, again, I think it's in the last 4 weeks, has declared Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt safe countries. So basically, they will return migrants, refugees who are coming from those countries because they have determined that part of Africa is no longer. There's no other factors that are threatening to the individual's political pursuits, their political liberties. I have a question from Jim and then from Bill.
Many of the policies that
Speak up.
Many of the policies that Donald Trump is advocating, in fact, have been carried out in far more in Europe, including confiscation of property in Denmark and I think Austria too now. How would you compare this set of policies to those that are taking place in Europe in terms of level of strength, coordination, effectiveness, extremism?
So I'll answer quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Isabel. I mean, I have not studied the policies of the populist parties in Europe in great detail, and quite frankly, I haven't invested yet enough time in what Donald Trump is proposing. You know, I know he says he's going to build a wall, he's going to make the Mexicans pay for it, right? But I think he's tapping into the same. It's interesting. He's tapping into a populism that doesn't have the same sort of basis in the United States as it does in Europe, right? The populism that the radical right-wing parties are tapping into is a populism that is nationalism, which is Trump is tapping into, but it's also an economic dislocation, right? You know, most European countries, with the exception of Germany, are still in recession. Unemployment rates are still relatively high, right? That's not the case for the U.S. economy as a whole, but he's tapping into, you know, I think an underlying populism, but I think, right, that populism is more of a dissatisfaction with government, as opposed to in Europe, it is a dissatisfaction with the economy, and it is a concern over the dilution of national culture. I don't know, and I could be wrong, I don't know that Donald Trump is tapping into kind of the cultural dimension, but I haven't paid enough, I think I've paid enough attention, but I'm no expert on Donald Trump. Do you want to talk about Germany?
The only thing I would add is confirming that a lot of survey data does suggest that a lot of European anti-immigrant sentiment is caused by their fear of like a lack of integration on the parts of the migrants, and a lot of them are also concerned about the nature of Islam or, you know, just threats to their culture in general. While I guess I would agree, like that might not be as seen in America, but I think that is still perhaps what Trump is diving into. But I also don't read up on him very much.
Yeah, Bill.
It's really great. I enjoyed it and learned a lot from the whole presentation. And so, David, I sort of, in response to this question here, there appears to be a hierarchy of values that get applied against potential migrants, right? There's political oppression, there's threat to human life, and then there's economic opportunity. And Western democracies all seem to have some version of that, and some assessment in each case about where you draw lines. So on the economics side, high value, high educated immigrants versus sort of low-skilled immigrants. As a result of this research, do you think differently about that hierarchy? Is the hierarchy roughly right and needs fine-tuning? Or the hierarchy no longer makes sense, particularly in moments of 12 civil wars raging, of course, for Europe, 12 civil wars raging between Marrakesh and Bangladesh, a great surge of humans in threat, that the bands of that need to be expanded and thought differently, or more or less the hierarchies are roughly right, and it just requires both fine-tuning and investment on the supply side as opposed to dealing with the demand side.
You know, answering the question about what's right is challenging for me. I approach this, wearing my hat as a social scientist and trying to figure out what's right for policymakers who are trying to who are trying to stay in power, right? But I think it's also important that the law gives shelter to a lot of criticism that can be and often is leveled at policymakers. So you think about you think about U.S. policy, right? And let's separate between immigration and then let's separate immigrants from refugees. So the United States provides 75,000 visas for refugees each year. Okay, I think Obama said that we were going to increase that number to 100,000 due to the Syrian crisis, but it was never made clear, either through Obama's speeches or through John Kerry, who announced this, whether that extra cap was going to be devoted specifically to Syrians. Okay, it was never, also, quite frankly, I'm speaking personally, it was never really made clear why only 25,000. right? We can talk about burden sharing, we can talk about all those kinds of things if you will, right? But you know, there's a policy reason why he said we're going to go up 25 and we're not going to go to 250,000 like we did after the fall of Saigon. Okay, you know, that's a very clear policy choice that's being made. I would argue it's because Obama didn't want to look like there's any U.S. responsibility for what's happening in Syria, right? And we could discuss that, but I think that's one of the reasons why that choice was made. Now, on the immigration side, the United States has a very different kind of immigration regime than almost any other Western European country. Right? Almost every other Western European, almost any other industrialized country, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or countries in Western Europe, I'm going to get these numbers slightly wrong, 83 to 86% of all the visas that are given in the United States are given for the purpose of family reunification. Right? So it doesn't matter if you're high skilled, low skilled, it doesn't matter any of your personal characteristics, but if you have a family member in the United States, there's an 86% probability that you're going to get a visa to enter. Right? On the other hand, if you look to our neighbors on the north, they have a system that's based upon points, okay? And it is designed to try and allow entry for individuals who have skills, right? And not just skills, but specific skills that are in need at a particular point in time. If there is a dearth of skilled medical workers and you are from Senegal and you have a medical degree, you're going to get more points, and the likelihood that you're going to be able to enter Canada is going to increase. Britain has this kind of policy, Australia and New Zealand has this kind of policy, and most other European countries have a number of different exceptions for skill level. Right? And it's in this case, again, that the U.S. is most definitely an outlier. Right? Now, why haven't we seen immigration reform in the United States? That's not a rhetorical question, but it's something that at the Miller Center we'll be answering in the coming year. That's a paid political advertisement, right? Right? But at the Miller Center we'll be answering that question. All right, so look for it sometime in October. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I know you said this in the very beginning that you don't want to get into this in this talk, but I'm still very interested. You said you're also doing research about the question why the immigrants are actually coming?
Yes.
Can you provide us with some basic ideas about that, and why do they especially target Germany and Sweden? Is it really just because they're really taking in refugees, or are there other reasons why they want to come to Germany?
So we think about refugees, we think about migrants. There are a couple of factors that we can say with reasonable confidence that are factors that choose migrants to choose specific destinations. Okay, we can think about the economy, right? So what's the probability that if I go to Germany versus France, I'm going to be employed? Okay. The second is, what are the rights for my children, right? So if we think about, again, assume that you're in a position where you can make a choice between different countries, all else equal, in some of the research I've done with some colleagues from the University of Colorado, we found that migrants are pulled to those countries where their children will have birthright citizenship. Okay? That it's not a matter of citizenship by blood, it's a matter of citizenship by soil, right? And so if those political rights exist, then you might be more likely to go to one of those countries than to another. And the third important component is, is really the importance of social networks. Okay, that if we think about, where are Syrians going, or where are migrants from El Salvador going, we can identify those communities with large numbers of Syrians in Germany, and those communities in the United States with a large number of El Salvadorians. Right? So if you want to, if you're interested in where these migrants from El Salvador are going to go, just look at Fairfax County, right? It's got the largest number of El Salvadorians per capita of any county in the United States, right? That's a pretty good explanation, or at least it helps us understand why you choose particular locations, okay? It's because there is a network there that will provide you with information, will provide with basically a social safety net. In the case that you can't find work or there are problems getting your papers processed, there's a community there that you can turn to that shares a common language, shares a common culture, and that common heritage matters a lot as we think about migrant destination choices. Yeah.
Let's add to this. You said the rights of the children. I think Germany has the right of blood, which means it's very hard to actually get this German citizenship. But to get into the Syrian refugee crisis, so are the Syrians that are coming to Germany because they want to stay there forever, or are they going to Germany because they want to stay there for the time of let's imagine in 10 years the war will be over.
I don't know.
Okay.
I think you ask us in 10 years. But that's not flippant. We don't have a lot of information on return migration, and there's very little data and even descriptive information on the intention of migrants to return, mostly because getting intentions information, we don't know if that translates into actual behavior, right? So you might tell me you intend to go back to Syria, but then you might say, oh, you know what? A year passed, I got married, or I got a job, and I changed my mind. So it's we don't know an awful lot about return migration or return refugees. We don't know an awful lot based upon this kind of intentionality sort of material that we might have. Yeah, Jeff. I'll go over here.
I'll do.
Yes, sir.
Just kind of curious more about the demographics again. I apologize, I might have hit on it earlier. You said the initial surge of refugees was middle class, well-educated Syrians, and then there was a followed by Iran, Iraq areas. I don't know exactly what you said, but initially I think it was families as well. Now you're seeing more of the young single men. Is there an exact breakdown of those demographics of what you're seeing? And also in terms of skill sets, are you seeing industrial trades? Are you seeing IT or something?
Yeah, we're really getting into the weeds in terms of we just don't have those data at this point in time. I mean, and let me be clear. I mean, one of the reasons we don't is because the UN High Commission for Refugees is really the clearinghouse for most of this information until refugees enter a country. So then we have to get that information from the German ministry, right? And they just haven't released that information yet. Right, so a lot of what I said earlier, that the impression was that these were highly educated middle-class Syrians. Again, all of this is descriptive, and we think we know this from a couple of reports from UNHCR and other entities, but I would be hard-pressed to draw any firm conclusions on that, because we don't know well enough to make policy pronouncements based upon that. It's speculative at this point in time. Yeah, Jeff.
I'm just wondering about the calculations from the other side. So how does ISIS and the Syrian regime think about this problem and whether it's a good thing or bad thing?
You see, I mean, ISIS, I don't know, right? But the Syrian regime, I mean, there's some work, and I think her name is Kelly Greenhill, who's up at Tufts University, has written a really interesting book talking about how regimes use the threat of unleashing refugees as a foreign policy tool, right? Basically what they tell their neighbors is, if you don't agree to this policy or that policy, we are going to unleash migrants. We're going to not defend or not protect the border. And I think this is pretty I think this is pretty effective in some cases. I'll give you one example at the risk of talking about something I really don't know anything about, but maybe people here know more about it. When North Korea, gosh, was this just in the fall, right? When North Korea launched when they said they detonated an atomic weapon, right, in the fall. The question that was always raised was, why didn't China respond more harshly? And one answer that I would come up with based upon the kind of work that we're doing is that there's a large population of North Koreans on the North Korea-China border, and there's an implicit threat from the North Korean regime that if China comes at them hard in terms of sanctions or public condemnation, that they will essentially loosen the border. Now, again, I don't know whether this is the case, but it's a reasonable way of taking what Kelly Greenhill has done and applying it to an event that we've seen recently. With regard to ISIS, I don't know. Other questions? Well, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So your research topic question is what kind of policy options are there for countries? And the way you do it is dividing the final destination countries or over the countries, depending on the situational condition, your policy options will be different.
That's correct.
So I'm trying to think on certain countries, like industries like Italy, for example, Greece. How do they use, are they facing refugee crisis as severe as Germany does? Or
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I mean, Southern Europe has not been affected, and even up to France have not been affected with near the intensity as we've seen in Northern Europe. I mean, again, you saw the charts that Isabel showed. They're really going through their Turkey, Bulgaria, maybe trying to get into Greece, but then ultimately heading up Croatia and to Germany. There's been I don't want to say it's not zero, but very little claims either for asylum or for refugee status in Greece, Italy, Spain. And I think part of that has to do with the lack of economic opportunities in those countries relative to Germany.
So do they know that they are functioning as buffer zones for refugees so that they will eventually go up?
I don't think they want to even let them in. So I don't think that Greece is going to say we're going to let you in, hoping that you're going to go up to Germany. I think Greece just doesn't even want to let them in to begin with, because there's a fear that they're going to stay. All right, I know that our time is up, and other people have things to do. So thank you very much for coming and for your questions and your participation.